Hi, welcome again to Believable RPG here on Verse Online. We're going to talk about a couple of things today. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about the development of political factions in the Middle Ages and how those kind of emerge into structures of government, and also a bit about what constitutes a kind of modern political movement now and where those come from. Okay, very simply, when you experience the High Middle Ages in Europe, in Great Britain here, for example, in England and Wales, the High Middle Ages were the Norman and kind of Plantagenet periods. The king owns everything. God has said that the king owns everything, and the Pope has okayed this. The king owns all the land, and the barons, unless they want some kind of civil war, which obviously you get under King John, and later under Henry III, unless they want some kind of civil war, they owe fealty to the king, and the king then distributes them land and gives them, nice jobs in government. And the king will call his most loyal barons together and create the beginnings of what would now be kind of like cabinet-style government. But they have an informal king's chamber. You see this on a slightly more advanced, later version of this would be the Privy Council that you get in the early modern period, particularly during the reign of the Tudor monarchs. And that's what they call the, I think it's the small chamber in Game of Thrones. The Privy Council is just really the private council. And it was the begins as a meeting, a much smaller meeting of noble advisors in the king's chambers. By the time of the Wars of the Roses, the king's council's huge. There are loads and loads of people, sometimes up to 100 nobles, of which a great many of them don't really do anything. But it's kind of good politics, good practice to be seen there. So when you get, during the 16th century, a slimming down and professionalisation of government, what emerges is government figures, nobles in the Privy Council that have specific portfolios, and they become specialists. They understand things like shipbuilding and agriculture and the law, and raising armies and minting coins and all that kind of stuff. They understand it in a lot of detail. And the Privy Council, again, it's a later body that comes along in about the 16th century, suddenly starts to become part of a joined-up system of government. The Privy Council would send out letters to Lord Lieutenants and sheriffs across the country saying, what's going on in Derbyshire, what's going on in Shropshire, what's going on in Kent, tell us, and here's also what you have to do. And then they would receive letters from them, and there would be dispatch riders going all across the country, taking letters back and forth. And so and this is based on the fact that you've got increasing levels of literacy. There are people to read and write these things. And a modern bureaucracy has to emerge in order to sort these letters. So this is one of the reasons why the Middle Ages is fundamentally different, or the early modern period is fundamentally different to the Middle Ages. You have increasingly joined up systems of communication up and down the land where people can send one another letters and talk to one another. So informality is a huge part of medieval government. Now, if you're creating a medieval fantasy world, a lot of what you will create, if you want it to be relatively faithful to the medieval fantasy worlds that existed, is a degree of informality, a degree of, well, because the king says so. It's like this because it's like this. And if the king has to answer to you, he'll do so with perhaps violent force, or he'll get the Pope's blessing, or whatever theological, religious figure you're going to create in your world, or whatever kind of, perhaps if you're going for a more high fantasy setting, what sort of divine intervention there is in your world. That's what backs up the king. It's not just me. I'm not just here on the throne. Now I'm here because God says so. In medieval Europe, particularly in medieval England, there was a concept of the great chain of being, the idea that there is God, then the angels, and then there's the king, and everybody else is below that. And you're ordained to be at a position in society. If you're a peasant, one of the reasons to not rebel against the king is because not only will you be hung, drawn and quartered when the rebellion inevitably goes wrong, but also, even if you win, you're going to hell because you've disobeyed God's divine order for things. The idea that sort of the world and social class is neatly stratified in the way that God intends, and you don't step out of that. So you might want to create in your fantasy world some sort of system of moral codes or a religious text that explains the structure of society. It doesn't have to be true, it can be utterly fraudulent and a way of keeping people in line. But people need to read and understand this, or at least be told it if they can't read, in order for them to behave in the way that they're intended to. Okay, so fast forwarding. We have, in most kind of modern industrialized countries, a series of political parties that emerged in the 19th century and developed in the 20th century, based around ideas of social class and class participation and class interests. So in the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain, the twin sort of political movements that emerge are conservatism and liberalism. Conservatism is the set of ideologies about ensuring that things don't really change and that society remains pretty much as neatly ordered as it was in the Middle Ages, and that if there is change, it's gradual and slow and piecemeal and doesn't really kind of do particularly very much. And as a result, the landowning classes are the ones that benefit. So in a fantasy world that you might be creating something steampunkish. There might be a political faction that's based on limiting change. You might have a political faction that sees magic as dangerous and revolutionary and really wants to keep the lid on that as much as possible. You might have a political faction that sees technology as something that's undesirable, not because it's bad in itself, but because it will start to reshape society in ways that are dangerous and unpredictable and will affect the rulership and the privilege of those on top. Liberalism was the ideology of the new industrial bourgeoisie. It was an ideology based on the notion of free trade, opening up Great Britain to flows of cheap food so that workers could be fed cheaply in towns and cities, and that the new industrialists didn't have to pay high wages. So it was about making sure that the landowning classes, who previously had a monopoly on food and made food very expensive, that they suffered at the expense of the new industrial bourgeoisie. Political parties, therefore, are the product of factional and class interests, and that is how they emerge in the way that they do. Of course, that's not a hard and fast rule for every political party in the world, but it's a good rule of thumb for the world that you're going to create. Think of who votes for these people, who funds these people, how they emerge, who supports them, because they can't exist without a support base of some description. When you look at the other kind of political faction, more so kind of like the terrorist political faction, things like the Zentarim, for example, in the Forgotten Realms world, these are kind of semi-feudal organisations that rule through brute force and kind of extractive power, where they simply rock up in your village and say, this belongs to us now, and anybody who steps out of line, we will deal with. And so they're slightly different, but they have to be based upon the extraction of resources, the extraction of wealth, and there has to be some kind of economic and social rationale for their existence. So always go back to that. Always think about the economic and social rationale for the existence of any phenomenon, because that's how you explain things in detail. And that's how you avoid this trap of going, well, there's a group of people and they're here and they're bad or good, and I sort of don't know why really, but they're kind of there. Where did they come from? How did they originate? Who wanted this group in the first place? Who created it? Who needed it? Who funded it? And that's true from kings and queens all the way through to modern politics. Thanks, all the best, and I'll catch you in the next video. Remember to subscribe, and there's some links and stuff for you down below. And yeah, come and find us. We're going to be at Dragon Meet. Come and find us at Dragon Meet. We will be there on December the 4th, and I'll put a link below for the tickets and all that jive. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.